The Gulf of Tonkin incident, also known as the USS Maddox incident, involved what were originally claimed to be two separate confrontations involving North Vietnam and the United States in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The original American report blamed North Vietnam for both incidents, but eventually became very controversial with widespread claims that either one or both incidents were false, and possibly purposefully so. On August 2, 1964, the destroyer USS Maddox, while performing a signals intelligence patrol as part of DESOTO operations, was pursued by three North Vietnamese Navy torpedo boats of the 135th Torpedo Squadron. Maddox fired 3 warning shots and the North Vietnamese boats then attacked with torpedoes and machine gun fire. Maddox expended over 283-inch and 5-inch shells in what was claimed to be a sea battle. 1 U.S. aircraft was damaged, 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats were allegedly damaged, and 4 North Vietnamese sailors were said to have been killed, with 6 more wounded. There were no U.S. casualties. Maddox was unscathed except for a single bullet hole from a Vietnamese machine gun round. It was originally claimed by the National Security Agency that a second Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred on August 4, 1964, as another sea battle, but instead evidence was found of Tonkin ghosts and not actual North Vietnamese torpedo boats. In the 2003 documentary The Fog of War, the former United States Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara admitted that the August 2 USS Maddox attack happened with no Defense Department response, but the August 4 Gulf of Tonkin attack never happened. The outcome of these two incidents was the passage by Congress of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to assist any Southeast Asian country whose government was considered to be jeopardized by communist aggression. The resolution served as Johnson's legal justification for deploying U.S. conventional forces and the commencement of open warfare against North Vietnam. In 1995, a former Secretary of Defense McNamara met with former Vietnam People's Army General Vo Nguyen Giap to ask what happened on August 4, 1964 in the second Gulf of Tonkin incident. "Absolutely nothing," Giap replied. Giap claimed that the attack had been imaginary. In 2005, an internal National Security Agency historical study was declassified. It concluded that Maddox had engaged the North Vietnamese Navy on August 2, but that there were no North Vietnamese naval vessels present during the incident of August 4. The report stated regarding the first incident on August 2 that at 1500 G, Captain Herrick ordered Ogua's gun crews to open fire if the boats approached within 10,000 yards. At about 1505 G, Maddox fired 3 rounds to warn off the communist boats. This initial action was never reported by the Johnson administration, which insisted that the Vietnamese boats fired first. Background: although the United States attended the Geneva Conference, which was intended to end hostilities between France and the Vietnamese at the end of the First Indochina War, it refused to sign the Geneva Accords. The accords mandated, among other measures, a temporary ceasefire line intended to separate Vietnamese and French forces, and elections to determine the future political fate of the Vietnamese within 2 years. It also forbade the political interference of other countries in the area, the creation of new governments without the stipulated elections, and foreign military presence. By 1961, President Ngo Dinh Diem faced significant discontent among some quarters of the southern population. including some Buddhists who were opposed to the rule of Diem's Catholic supporters, after suppressing Viet Minh political cadres who were legally campaigning between 1955 and 1959 for the promised elections. Diem faced a growing communist-led uprising that intensified by 1961, headed by the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred during the first year of the Johnson administration. While Kennedy had originally supported the policy of sending military advisors to Diem, he had begun to alter his thinking due to what he perceived to be the ineptitude of the Saigon government and its inability and unwillingness to make needed reforms. Shortly before his assassination, in November 1963, Kennedy had begun a limited recall of U.S. forces. Johnson's views were likewise complex, but he had supported military escalation as a means of challenging what was perceived to be the Soviet Union's expansionist policies. The Cold War policy of containment was to be applied to prevent the fall of Southeast Asia to communism under the precepts of the domino theory. After Kennedy's assassination, Johnson ordered in more U.S. forces to support the Saigon government, beginning a protracted United States presence in Southeast Asia. A highly classified program of covert actions against North Vietnam known as Operation Plan 34 Alpha, in conjunction with the DESOTO operations, had begun under the Central Intelligence Agency in 1961. In 1964 the program was transferred to the U.S. Defense Department and conducted by the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. For the maritime portion of the covert operation, a set of fast patrol boats had been purchased quietly from Norway and sent to South Vietnam. In 1963, 3 young Norwegian skippers traveled on a mission in South Vietnam. They were recruited for the job by the Norwegian intelligence officer Alf Martinsmeyer. Martinsmeyer, who was head of department at the military intelligence staff, operated on behalf of U.S. intelligence. The 3 skippers did not know who Meyer really was when they agreed to a job that involved them in sabotage missions against North Vietnam. Although the crews of the boats were South Vietnamese naval personnel, approval for each mission conducted under the plan came directly from Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, Jr., CINCPAC in Honolulu, who received his orders from the White House. After the coastal attacks began, Hanoi lodged a complaint with the International Control Commission, which had been established in 1954 to oversee the terms of the Geneva Accords, but the U.S. denied any involvement. 4 years later, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara admitted to Congress that the U.S. ships had in fact been cooperating in the South Vietnamese attacks against North Vietnam. Maddox, although aware of the operations, was not directly involved. What was generally not considered by U.S. politicians at the time were the other actions taken under Operations Plan 34 Alpha just prior to the incident. The night before the launching of the actions against North Vietnamese facilities on Hon My and Hon Ngu Islands, the SOG had launched a covert long-term agent team into North Vietnam, which was promptly captured. That night 2 flights of CIA-sponsored Laotian fighter bombers attacked border outposts well within southwestern North Vietnam. The Hanoi government probably assumed that they were all a coordinated effort to escalate military actions against North Vietnam. The incident. Daniel Ellsberg, who was on duty in the Pentagon the night of August 4, receiving messages from the ship, reported that the ship was on a secret electronic warfare support measures mission near northern Vietnamese territorial waters. On July 31, 1964, USS Maddox had begun her intelligence collection mission in the Gulf of Tonkin. Captain George Stephen Morrison was in command of local American forces from his flagship US-Bonhomme Richard. Maddox was under orders not to approach closer than 8 miles from the North's coast and 4 miles from Hon Niu Island. When the SOG commando raid was being carried out against Hon Niu, the ship was 120 miles away from the attacked area. First attack in July 1964, the situation along North Vietnam's territorial waters had reached a near boil, due to South Vietnamese commando raids and airborne operations that inserted intelligence teams into North Vietnam, as well as North Vietnam's military response to these operations. On the night of July 30, 1964, South Vietnamese commandos attacked a North Vietnamese radar station on Hon Mi Island. According to Han Yok, it would be attacks on these islands, especially Hon Mi, by South Vietnamese commandos, along with the proximity of the Maddox, that would set off the confrontation, although the Maddox did not participate in the commando attacks. In this context, on July 31, Maddox began patrols of the North Vietnamese coast to collect intelligence coming within a few miles of Hon Mi Island. A U.S. aircraft carrier, the US Ticonderoga, was also stationed nearby. By August 1, North Vietnamese patrol boats were tracking Maddox, and several intercepted communications indicated that they were preparing to attack Maddox. Maddox retreated, but the next day, August 2, Maddox, which had a top speed of 28 knots, resumed her routine patrol, and 3 North Vietnamese P-4 torpedo boats with a top speed of 50 knots began to follow Maddox. Intercepted communications indicated that the vessels intended to attack Maddox. As the ships approached from the southwest, Maddox changed course from northeasterly to southeasterly and increased speed to 25 knots. On the afternoon of August 2, as the torpedo boats neared, Maddox fired 3 warning shots. The North Vietnamese boats then attacked, and Maddox radioed she was under attack from the 3 boats, closing to within 10 nautical miles. While located 28 nautical miles away from the North Vietnamese coast in international waters, Maddox stated she had evaded a torpedo attack and opened fire with its 5-inch guns, forcing the torpedo boats away. 2 of the torpedo boats had come as close as 5 nautical miles, released 1 torpedo each, but neither one was effective, coming no closer than about 100 yards after Maddox evaded them. Another P-4 received a direct hit from a 5-inch shell from Maddox. Its torpedo malfunctioned at launch. 4 USNF-8 Crusader jets launched from the aircraft carrier US Ticonderoga, and 15 minutes after Maddox had fired her initial warning shots, attacked the retiring P-4s, claiming 1 was sunk and 1 heavily damaged. Maddox suffered only minor damage from a single 14.5mm bullet from a P-4 SKPV heavy machine gun into her superstructure. Retiring to South Vietnamese waters, Maddox was joined by the destroyer Astana Joy. The North Vietnamese claimed that Maddox was hit by 1 torpedo, and 1 of the American aircraft had been shot down. The original account from the Pentagon Papers has been revised in light of a 2005 internal NSA historical study, which stated on page 17, at 1500G, Captain Herrick ordered Ogua's gun crews to open fire if the boats approached within 10,000 yards. At about 1505G, Maddox fired 3 rounds to warn off the communist boats. This initial action was never reported by the Johnson administration, which insisted that the Vietnamese boats fired first. Maddox, when confronted, was approaching Hon Mi Island, 3 to 4 nautical miles inside the 12 nautical miles limit claimed by North Vietnam. This territorial limit was unrecognized by the United States. After the skirmish, President Johnson ordered Maddox and Turner Joy to stage daylight runs into North Vietnamese waters, testing the 12 nautical miles limit and North Vietnamese resolve. These runs into North Vietnamese territorial waters coincided with South Vietnamese coastal raids and were interpreted as coordinated operations by the North, which officially acknowledged the engagements of August 2, 1964. Others, such as Admiral Sharp, maintained that U.S. actions did not provoke the August 2 incident. He claimed that the North Vietnamese had tracked Maddox along the coast by radar, and were thus aware that the destroyer had not actually attacked North Vietnam and that Hanoi had ordered its craft to engage Maddox anyway. North Vietnamese General Phung The later claimed that Maddox had been tracked since July 31 and that she had attacked fishing boats on August 2, forcing the North Vietnamese Navy to fight back. Sharp also noted that orders given to Maddox to stay 8 nautical miles off the North Vietnamese coast put the ship in international waters, as North Vietnam claimed only a 5 nautical miles limit as its territory. In addition, many nations had previously carried out similar missions all over the world, and the destroyer John R. Craig had earlier conducted an intelligence-gathering mission in similar circumstances without incident. However, Sharp's claims include some factually incorrect statements. North Vietnam never claimed a 5-mile limit for its territorial waters. Instead, it adhered to a 20-kilometer limit claimed by French Indochina in 1936. Moreover, it officially claimed a 12 nanometers limit, which is practically identical to the old 20 kilometers French claim. After the incidents of August, in September 1964, the North Vietnamese stance is that they always considered a 12-mile limit, consistently with the positions regarding the law of the sea of both the Soviet Union and China, the main allies. Second attack on August 4, another DESOTO patrol off the North Vietnamese coast was launched by Maddox and Turner Joy, in order to show the flag after the first incident. This time their orders indicated that the ships were to close to no less than 11 miles from the coast of North Vietnam. During an evening and early morning of rough weather and heavy seas, the destroyers received radar, sonar, and radio signals that they believed signaled another attack by the North Vietnamese Navy. For some 4 hours the ships fired on radar targets and maneuvered vigorously amid electronic and visual reports of enemies. Despite the Navy's claim that 2 attacking torpedo boats had been sunk, there was no wreckage, bodies of dead North Vietnamese sailors, or other physical evidence present at the scene of the alleged engagement. At 1:27 Washington time, Herrick sent a cable in which he acknowledged that the second attack may not have happened and that there may actually have been no Vietnamese craft in the area. Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and over-eager sonarmen may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings by Maddox suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken. 1 hour later, Herrick sent another cable, stating, "Entire action leaves many doubts except for apparent ambush at beginning. Suggest thorough reconnaissance in daylight by aircraft." Quote, in response to requests for confirmation, at around 1600 Washington time, Herrick cabled, "Details of action present a confusing picture, although certain that the original ambush was bona fide." At 1800 Washington time, Herrick cabled yet again, this time stating, "The first boat to close the Maddox probably launched a torpedo at the Maddox which was heard but not seen. All subsequent Maddox torpedo reports are doubtful in that it is suspected that sonarman was hearing the ship's own propeller beat." Within 30 minutes of August 4th incident, President Johnson had decided on retaliatory attacks. That same day he used the hotline to Moscow, and assured the Soviets he had no intent in opening a broader war in Vietnam. Early on August 5th, Johnson publicly ordered retaliatory measures, stating, "The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage." 1 hour and 40 minutes after his speech, U.S. aircraft reached North Vietnamese targets. On August 5th, at 10:40, these planes flying from U.S. aircraft carriers bombed 4 torpedo boat bases and an oil storage facility in Vinh, the United States' response. President Johnson's speech to the American people shortly before midnight on August 4th. President Johnson interrupted national television to make an announcement in which he described an attack by North Vietnamese vessels on 2 U.S. Navy warships, Maddox and Turner Joy, and requested authority to undertake a military response. Johnson's speech repeated the theme that dramatized Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh as the aggressor, and which put the U.S. into a more acceptable defensive posture. Johnson also referred to the attacks as having taken place on the high seas, suggesting that they had occurred in international waters. He emphasized commitment to both the American people and the South Vietnamese government. He also reminded Americans that there was no desire for war. A close scrutiny of Johnson's public statements reveals no mention of preparations for overt warfare and no indication of the nature and extent of covert land and air measures that already were operational. Johnson's statements were short to minimize the U.S. role in the conflict. A clear inconsistency existed between Johnson's actions and his public discourse. Reaction from Congress. While President Johnson's final resolution was being drafted, Senator Wayne Morse attempted to hold a fundraiser to raise awareness about possible faulty records of the incident involving Maddox. Morse supposedly received a call from an informant who has remained anonymous, urging Morse to investigate official logbooks of Maddox. These logs were not available before President Johnson's resolution was presented to Congress. After urging Congress that they should be wary of President Johnson's coming attempt to convince Congress of his resolution, Morse failed to gain enough cooperation and support from his colleagues to mount any sort of movement to stop it. Immediately after the resolution was read and presented to Congress, Morse began to fight it. He contended in speeches to Congress that the actions taken by the United States were actions outside the Constitution and were acts of war rather than acts of defense. Morse's efforts were not immediately met with support, largely because he revealed no sources and was working with very limited information. It was not until after the United States became more involved in the war that his claim began to gain support throughout the United States government. Morse was defeated when he ran for re-election in 1968. Distortion of the event. Evidence was still being sought on the night of August 4 when Johnson gave his address to the American public on the incident. Messages recorded that day indicate that neither President Johnson nor Secretary McNamara was certain of an attack. Various news sources, including Time, Life and Newsweek, ran articles throughout August on the Tonkin Gulf incident. Time reported, "Through the darkness, from the west and south, intruders boldly sped, at least 6 of them. They opened fire on the destroyers with automatic weapons, this time from as close as 2,000 yards. Time stated that there was no doubt in Sharp's mind that the U.S. would now have to answer this attack. and that there was no debate or confusion within the administration regarding the incident. The use of the set of incidents as a pretext for escalation of U.S. involvement follows the issuance of public threats against North Vietnam, as well as calls from American politicians in favor of escalating the war. On May 4, 1964, William Bundy called for the U.S. to drive the Communists out of South Vietnam, even if that meant attacking both North Vietnam and Communist China. Even so, the Johnson administration in the second half of 1964 focused on convincing the American public that there was no chance of war between North Vietnam and the U.S. North Vietnam's General GIP suggested that the DESOTO patrol had been sent into the Gulf to provoke North Vietnam into giving an excuse for escalation of the war. Various government officials and men aboard Maddox have suggested similar theories. American politicians and strategists had been planning provocative actions against North Vietnam for some time. George Bull told a British journalist after the war that, at the time, many people were looking for any excuse to initiate bombing. According to Raymond McGovern, a retired CIA officer, CIA analyst from 1963 to 1990, and in the 1980s, chairman of the National Intelligence Estimates, the CIA, not to mention President Lyndon Johnson, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy all knew full well that the evidence of any armed attack on the evening of August 4, 1964, the so-called Second Tonkin Gulf incident, was highly dubious. During the summer of 1964, President Johnson and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were eager to widen the war in Vietnam. They stepped up sabotage and hit-and-run attacks on the coast of North Vietnam. Maddox, carrying electronic spying gear, was to collect signals intelligence from the North Vietnamese coast, and the coastal attacks were seen as a helpful way to get the North Vietnamese to turn on their coastal radars. For this purpose, it was authorized to approach the coast as close as 8 miles and the offshore islands as close as 4. The latter had already been subjected to shelling from the sea. In his book, Body of Secrets, James Bamford, who spent 3 years in the United States Navy as an intelligence analyst, writes that the primary purpose of the Maddox was to act as a seagoing provocateur, to poke its sharp gray bow and the American flag as close to the belly of North Vietnam as possible, in effect shoving its 5-inch cannons up the nose of the Communist Navy. The Maddox mission was made even more provocative by being timed to coincide with commando raids, creating the impression that the Maddox was directing those missions. Thus, the North Vietnamese had every reason to believe that Maddox was involved in these actions. Provocative action against North Vietnam was considered after the August 1964 incidents. John McNaughton suggested in September 1964 that the U.S. prepare to take actions to provoke a North Vietnamese military reaction, including plans to use DESOTO patrols north. William Bundy's paper dated September 8, 1964, suggested more DESOTO patrols as well. Consequences: U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara failed to inform U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson that the U.S. Naval Task Group commander in the Tonkin Gulf, Captain John J. Herrick, had changed his mind about the alleged North Vietnamese torpedo attack on U.S. warships he had reported earlier that day. By early afternoon of August 4, Washington time, Herrick had reported to the Commander-in-Chief Pacific in Honolulu that freak weather effects on the ship's radar had made such an attack questionable. In fact, Herrick was now saying, in a message sent at 1:27 p.m. Washington time, that no North Vietnamese patrol boats had actually been sighted. Herrick now proposed a complete evaluation before any further action taken. McNamara later testified that he had read the message after his return to the Pentagon that afternoon, but he did not immediately call Johnson to tell him that the whole premise of his decision at lunch to approve McNamara's recommendation for retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam was now highly questionable. Had Johnson been accurately informed about the Herrick message, he might have demanded fuller information before proceeding with a broadening of the war. Johnson had fended off proposals from McNamara and other advisers for a policy of bombing the North on 4 separate occasions since becoming president. President Johnson, who was up for election that year, ordered retaliatory airstrikes and went on national television on August 4. Although Maddox had been involved in providing intelligence support for South Vietnamese attacks at Hon Me and Hon Ngu, Johnson denied in his testimony before Congress that the U.S. Navy had supported South Vietnamese military operations in the Gulf. He thus characterized the attack as unprovoked, since the ship had been in international waters. As a result of his testimony on August 7, Congress passed a joint resolution titled the Southeast Asia Resolution, which granted President Johnson the authority to conduct military operations in Southeast Asia without the benefit of a declaration of war. The resolution gave President Johnson approval to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed force, to assist any member or protocol state of the Southeast Asia Collective Defense Treaty requesting assistance in defense of its freedom.